Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he thought he had developed an unshakable professional composure that would allow him to handle any situation that arose on stage. He had witnessed confessions of hidden identities, stories of wartime sacrifice, testimonies of lifelong regrets, revelations about secret pasts, and heartbreaking tales of survival and loss. But on that unseasonably warm March afternoon in 2026, a 95-year-old man named Bill Thompson would share something so completely unexpected, so profoundly moving in its revelation of a childhood secret that had shaped an entire life, that Steve's jaw would literally drop open in shock. He would stand frozen for nearly a minute, unable to form words, and everyone in the studio would find themselves witnessing not a tale of tragedy or scandal, but rather the bittersweet story of a lie told in love that had protected a child for 9 decades, while simultaneously creating a burden of gratitude and confusion that had never been fully resolved. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Morrison family from Ohio and the Thompson family from Tennessee. The Thompson family immediately drew attention because at their center stood William Thompson, a remarkably spry 95-year-old man with a full head of white hair, bright blue eyes that still sparkled with intelligence, and a bearing that suggested both strength and a certain emotional vulnerability. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt with suspenders, moved confidently with only a cane for support, and had an air of someone who had lived a long life with purpose, but who was carrying something heavy that needed to be set down. His family surrounded him with obvious affection, 4 generations including his daughter Margaret, who was in her early 70s, his grandson Robert in his late 40s, his great-granddaughter Emma in her early 20s, and even a great-great-grandson, a toddler who kept trying to grab Pop's cane. During the pre-interview, Bill had been articulate and engaging, answering questions with thoughtful precision and occasionally making jokes that had the producers laughing. When asked about his long life, he had mentioned that he was born in 1930, had grown up during the Depression, had served in the Korean War, and had worked as a schoolteacher for 40 years before retiring. But when asked if there was anything special he wanted to share on the show, he had said something that caught the producer's attention. "I'm 95 years old, and there's something about my childhood that I only learned the truth about 10 years ago when I was 85. For 85 years, I believed a story about who I was and where I came from, and when I finally learned the truth, it changed everything I thought I understood about my life. I want to tell my family the whole story because they know part of it, but they don't know everything, and I think they deserve to understand why I've been so emotional these last 10 years, why I've been trying to find information about people they've never heard me mention before." Bill's daughter Margaret, when asked about her father, had spoken with obvious love and a certain curiosity, saying, "Me father has always been a wonderful dad, steady, reliable, loving, wise. But about 10 years ago something changed. He became more reflective, more emotional, and he started asking questions about his childhood that he'd never asked before. He started trying to track down records from the 1930s, trying to find information about people from his early life. When I asked him what he was looking for, he would just say he was trying to understand something about his past. He's mentioned a few times that he learned something that changed how he understood his whole life, but he's never fully explained it. So I'm very curious about what he's planning to share today." The Thompson family won their game with excellent teamwork, Bill contributing several answers that showed a quick mind and deep knowledge. As they lined up for fast money, there was no question that Bill would be one of the 2 players. He had insisted from the beginning that standing at the podium was his primary reason for being there. His great-granddaughter Emma went first and scored 189 points, which meant Bill needed only 11 points to win the $20,000, virtually guaranteed. But as Bill approached the podium, Steve noticed that the elderly man's hands were trembling, that his eyes were already glistening with unshed tears, and that he kept touching his chest as if steadying his heart. Steve approached him with his characteristic warmth, sensing something significant was about to happen, and said gently, "Mr. Thompson, you all right, sir? You need a moment." Bill shook his head and said in a voice that carried 9 decades of emotion, I'm fine, Mr. Harvey. I just need to tell a story I should have told my family years ago when I first learned the truth. I need to tell them about the lie that saved me, about the people who loved me enough to deceive me, and about what I only discovered 10 years ago when I was going through some old documents and everything I thought I knew about my childhood turned out to be a beautiful, heartbreaking fiction. Steve's expression shifted immediately from entertainer to deeply attentive human being, and he said quietly, "Sir, take your time. Tell us whatever you need to tell us." The studio fell into that particular expectant silence that happens when everyone senses they're about to hear something profound. Bill turned to face his family and said, "Margaret, Robert, Emma, and all of you, I need to tell you about my parents. The people I've always called Mom and Dad, the people who raised me, the people whose names are on my birth certificate, and who I loved with all my heart. I need to tell you the truth about who they were and what they did for me, because what they did was one of the most selfless acts of love I've ever known, and I only discovered it 10 years ago, 60 years after they both died, when I finally understood the full story of my childhood." The studio was completely silent, everyone transfixed by Bill's obvious emotion. He continued, "I was born in 1930, or at least that's what I always believed. I grew up as William Thompson, son of James and Helen Thompson, in a small town in Tennessee. My parents, the people I called Mom and Dad, they loved me, they raised me, they gave me a good childhood despite the Depression, and they died in the 1960s when I was in my 30s. I mourned them deeply, and I've honored their memory my entire life. But there was always something I didn't quite understand, something that didn't quite add up, but that I never questioned because I had no reason to question it. My parents never talked about my early childhood, never had baby pictures of me, never told stories about my birth or my first years. When I asked, they would say the pictures were lost in a fire, or they would change the subject. I accepted these explanations because I trusted them and because I had no reason to doubt." Steve's face showed he was beginning to understand that something unexpected was coming. Bill said, "In 2016, when I was 85 years old, I was going through some old documents, my parents' papers that had been in storage for decades. I found an envelope I'd never seen before, tucked in the back of a Bible that had belonged to my mother. Inside the envelope was a letter dated 1935, written by my mother Helen to her sister, my aunt who had died long before I was born. The letter was about me, about my adoption, and about a promise my parents had made to keep the truth from me to protect me from pain. I sat there at 85 years old reading this letter, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about my identity was not exactly true, or rather, it was true in the ways that mattered but false in the factual details." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and she said, "Dad, what are you saying? You were adopted?" Bill nodded, tears now flowing down his weathered face, and he said, "Yes, Margaret, I was adopted when I was approximately 4 years old in 1934, though the exact details are unclear because the adoption was never formalized legally. It was an informal arrangement during the Depression when such things were more common. But here's what I learned from that letter and from the research I've done over the last 10 years. The people I knew as James and Helen Thompson were not my biological parents. They were actually my biological mother's sister and her husband, my aunt and uncle. My biological mother was Helen's younger sister, whose name was Rose. And the reason I was raised by my aunt and uncle as their son, rather than being raised by Rose as her son, is because Rose was unmarried when she became pregnant with me in 1929, and in those days, being an unwed mother was a scandal that could destroy a woman's life and her child's future." The studio gasped collectively, and Steve's jaw literally dropped open, his mouth hanging agape as he processed what Bill was revealing. Bill continued, "Rose was 19 years old in 1929 when she became pregnant with me. The father was a man she loved but who couldn't or wouldn't marry her. The letter didn't specify the details. Rose's family, including Helen, faced a terrible situation. Rose could keep me and face social ostracism, poverty, and shame that would follow both of us for our entire lives. Or she could give me up for adoption to strangers and never see me again. Or she could do what they ultimately decided to do, give me to Helen and James to raise as their own, with the understanding that Rose would be my aunt, and would stay in my life but would never tell me she was actually my mother. Steve finally found his voice, though it was shaking, and said, "Mr. Thompson, you're telling us that your mother, the woman you called Mom, was actually your aunt, and your aunt, who you thought was your aunt, was actually your mother?" Bill nodded and said, "Yes, Mr. Harvey. Helen, the woman who raised me and who I called Mom my entire life, was actually my biological aunt. She and her husband James agreed to take me when I was an infant and to raise me as their son, giving me their name, claiming me as their biological child, and never telling me the truth. And Rose, who I knew as Aunt Rose, who visited often, who was kind to me and who I loved but who I thought was just my aunt. She was actually my biological mother. She gave me up to her sister to save me from the stigma of illegitimacy, and then she stayed in my life as Aunt Rose, so she could watch me grow up, could be part of my life, could love me from a distance, but could never tell me the truth or claim me as her son." The emotion in the studio was overwhelming, people crying openly at this revelation of sacrifice and secret love. Bill said, "What I learned from the letter my mother, Helen, wrote to her sister was the reasoning behind this arrangement. Helen wrote that Rose was heartbroken to give me up, but that she understood that in 1930, being an illegitimate child would have marked me for life, would have limited my opportunities, would have subjected me to cruelty and prejudice. Helen wrote that Rose loved me enough to sacrifice being my mother publicly so that I could have a normal life with a legitimate family. Helen also wrote about how painful it was to watch Rose interact with me as Aunt Rose rather than as my mother, how Rose would hold me and play with me and clearly love me deeply, but then would have to leave and go back to her own life while I stayed with Helen and James. Helen wrote that it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking act of love she had ever witnessed." Bill paused, struggling to compose himself, and Steve had sat down on the edge of the stage, his face in his hands, clearly overwhelmed. Bill continued, "Rose never married. She lived her whole life as a single woman, working as a seamstress, living alone, visiting us regularly throughout my childhood and into my adulthood. I always thought she was just a devoted aunt who loved her nephew. I never had any idea that every time she looked at me, every time she hugged me, every time she had to say goodbye and go home alone, she was loving her son while pretending to be his aunt. She died in 1975 when I was 45 years old, and she never told me the truth. Helen and James both died in the 1960s without ever telling me. All three of them, Rose, Helen, and James, they carried this secret their entire lives to protect me from the stigma of being illegitimate, to give me a normal childhood and a normal life." Margaret was sobbing, and she said, "Dad, Rose was your mother. Aunt Rose, who I remember from when I was little, who was always so sweet and who seemed so sad sometimes. She was actually my grandmother." Bill nodded and said, "Yes, sweetheart. Rose was my mother and your biological grandmother. The woman you knew as your grandmother, Helen, was actually your great-aunt. But they all loved us. They all did what they thought was right to protect me and to give me the best possible life in a time when illegitimacy was a genuine social disaster. They sacrificed truth for my well-being, and I can't fault them for that, even though learning the truth at 85 years old was shocking and painful." Steve stood back up and said, his voice still shaking, "Mr. Thompson, how did you feel when you learned this? What was it like to discover at 85 years old that your entire identity was different from what you'd believed?" Bill thought for a moment and said, "It was complicated, Mr. Harvey. Part of me felt betrayed, felt angry that they had lied to me my entire life, felt grief that I had never known Rose as my mother and had never been able to tell her I knew the truth and that I loved her and that I understood why she did what she did. But mostly, I felt overwhelmed by love and gratitude, because what Rose did, giving me up to her sister so I could have a legitimate life, staying in my life as an aunt so she could watch me grow up but sacrificing ever being acknowledged as my mother, that was one of the purest acts of love I can imagine. And what Helen and James did, taking me in, raising me as their son, loving me completely, and maintaining the secret to protect me, that was equally loving. They all lied to me, yes, but they lied out of love. to protect me from a stigma that would have marked me in ways we can't even imagine now. Bill looked at his family and said, "I've spent the last 10 years researching Rose, trying to learn about her life, trying to understand who she was beyond the Aunt Rose I knew. I found her diary, I found letters she wrote, and I learned that she never stopped loving me, never stopped thinking of herself as my mother, even though she could never claim that role publicly. She wrote about watching me grow up, about being proud of me, about loving me from a distance, and about the pain of never being able to tell me the truth. She wrote that the greatest joy and greatest sorrow of her life were the same thing. Having a son that she loved but could never acknowledge as her son." Reading those words at 85 years old, understanding what she had sacrificed, it broke my heart and filled my heart at the same time. Bill reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it up and said, "This is a picture of Rose holding me when I was a baby, probably about 6 months old. I found this photograph in the envelope with the letter. For my entire life, I thought this was just a picture of me with my aunt, but it's actually a picture of me with my mother, one of the only pictures that exists of us together before she gave me to Helen and James. Look at her face in this photograph. You can see the love and the sorrow. She's holding her baby boy, knowing she's about to give him up, knowing she'll watch him grow up calling another woman mom while she's just Aunt Rose. That's what sacrifice looks like. That's what mother's love looks like." Steve asked to see the photograph, and when Bill handed it to him, Steve looked at it for a long moment, then held it up for the camera while being careful to show it respectfully. The image showed a young woman, probably about 20 years old, holding a baby and looking at the camera with an expression that was indeed a mixture of love and profound sadness. Steve said, "Mr. Thompson, this photograph is beautiful and heartbreaking. You can see everything in her face. The love, the sorrow, the sacrifice. This is your mother Rose, and you didn't know it for 85 years. Bill nodded and said, "Yes, Mr. Harvey. That's my mother, and I spent my whole life thinking she was my aunt, and she let me believe that because she loved me enough to sacrifice being acknowledged as my mother so that I could have a better life." Bill turned back to his family and said, "I'm telling you this story now, publicly, for several reasons. First, because you deserve to know the full truth about our family history. Rose was my mother, which makes her your grandmother and great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother. She deserves to be acknowledged and remembered as such, not just as Aunt Rose, but as Rose Thompson, my mother, who loved me enough to give me up and who stayed in my life in the only way she could. Second, because I want Rose's sacrifice to be recognized and honored. She made an impossible choice to protect me from the social stigma of illegitimacy, and she lived her entire life carrying the pain of that choice so that I could have a normal life. That deserves to be acknowledged and respected." Bill paused and then said, "Third, I'm telling this story because I think it says something important about how we define family and parenthood. Helen and James raised me, loved me, gave me a home and an identity and a future, and they were my parents in every way that matters. But Rose was also my parent. She gave me life, she loved me, she made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure my well-being. Both are true. I can honor Helen and James as my mom and dad while also acknowledging Rose as my mother. Love isn't diminished by being shared among multiple people, it's multiplied, and I want my family to understand that having multiple people who loved me and sacrificed for me doesn't confuse my identity. It enriches it." Emma, the great-granddaughter, spoke up and said with obvious emotion, Pop, you're telling us that the woman we all thought was your aunt was actually your mother, and that she spent her whole life loving you from a distance, pretending to be someone else, so you could have a better life. That's one of the most beautiful and sad things I've ever heard." Bill nodded and said, "Yes, Emma. That's exactly what I'm telling you, and I want you to remember Rose, to honor her, to understand that the choices women had to make in the 1930s were often impossible choices, and that Rose chose love over acknowledgement, my well-being over her own happiness, my future over her own identity as my mother. That kind of sacrifice deserves to be remembered." Steve Harvey, who had been quiet for several minutes absorbing everything, finally said, "Mr. Thompson, I am absolutely stunned by what you've shared. The story of your biological mother Rose giving you to her sister to raise, so you wouldn't face the stigma of illegitimacy, staying in your life as your aunt, so she could watch you grow up, but never being able to claim you as her son, and you not learning the truth until you were 85 years old. This is one of the most bittersweet stories I've ever heard. It's a story about sacrifice, about the different forms that love can take, about the impossible choices people made in different eras, and about how family is both biology and choice and everything in between. He turned to the camera and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. William Thompson just shared that the woman he knew his entire life as his Aunt Rose was actually his biological mother, who gave him up to her sister to protect him from social stigma, but stayed in his life so she could love him from a distance." He learned this truth at age 85, 60 years after all three people involved, his biological mother Rose, and the aunt and uncle who raised him as their son, had died. This is a story that challenges how we think about truth and lies, about what we owe to children in terms of honesty versus protection, and about how profound sacrifices can look like simple kindness when you don't know the full story. I don't even know how to process this, but I know it's important, and I know everyone watching needs to take it to heart. The episode that aired became one of the most discussed and emotionally powerful programs in the show's history, with over 80 million viewers and countless discussions about adoption, family secrets, illegitimacy, and social stigma in earlier eras, and the complex ethics of lying to children to protect them from painful truths. The show received hundreds of thousands of messages from viewers, many from people who had learned late in life about adoptions or secret parentage, others from people who had given up children and never been able to acknowledge them, and still others from people who were grateful their families had kept similar secrets that protected them from stigma or pain. Adoption and genealogy organizations reported massive increases in people seeking information about their origins, with many citing Bill's story as inspiration for finally asking questions about family mysteries they had long wondered about. Mental health professionals discussed the psychological impact of learning fundamental identity information late in life, noting that while the truth can be shocking and painful, many people like Bill ultimately find meaning and connection in understanding their full histories. Historians and sociologists used Bill's story to discuss the historical reality of illegitimacy stigma, explaining that in the early to mid-20th century, being born out of wedlock could genuinely destroy life opportunities and subject children to cruelty and discrimination throughout their lives. They noted that informal adoptions like Bill's, where family members took in children born under scandalous circumstances and raised them as their own while maintaining the fiction of legitimacy, were far more common than most people realized, and that countless people today are probably descendants of similar arrangements without knowing it. Bill lived for another year after his appearance on Family Feud, dying peacefully in his sleep in April 2027, just 2 months after his 96th birthday. In that final year, he devoted himself to honoring Rose's memory and telling her story. He created a detailed family history that explicitly acknowledged Rose as his biological mother, that included her diary entries and letters, and that documented her sacrifice and her lifelong love for the son she could never publicly claim. He also established a small scholarship in Rose's name for young single mothers pursuing education, saying, "Rose gave up so much to protect me from stigma. The least I can do is help other young mothers who are facing similar difficult circumstances, though thankfully the stigma is less severe today than it was in 1930. Bill also spent time in his final year trying to learn everything he could about Rose's life, talking to distant relatives who had known her, researching records from the town where she had lived, and piecing together the story of the woman who had been his mother, but who he had only known as his aunt. He said in interviews that this research felt like getting to know his mother for the first time, that he was discovering who Rose had been as a person beyond her role as his secret mother, and that every new piece of information made him love and respect her more. Bill's funeral included extensive tributes to both the parents who raised him, Helen and James, and to his biological mother Rose, acknowledging the complex truth that he had been loved and parented by three people in different ways. Margaret gave a eulogy that honored all of them, saying, "My father was raised by people he thought were his biological parents, but who were actually his aunt and uncle. His biological mother was in his life as his aunt, loving him from a distance, never able to acknowledge him as her son. When he learned the truth at 85, he didn't become bitter or angry. Instead, he spent his final 10 years honoring all three of them, understanding that they had all loved him in different ways and had all sacrificed for his well-being. He taught us that family is complicated, that love can take many forms, that truth and deception can coexist when deception is motivated by protection and love, and that it's never too late to learn your full story and to honor all the people who contributed to making you who you are." The photograph of Rose holding baby Bill, the photograph that Bill had treasured during his final 10 years, was placed in his casket with him, reuniting mother and son in death in a way they had never been united in life. At Bill's request, his epitaph acknowledged the full truth of his parentage. William Thompson, 1930–2027, beloved son of Rose Thompson and raised with love by Helen and James Thompson, devoted father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, spent 95 years believing one story and 10 years understanding the fuller truth. Grateful for all who loved him. Steve Harvey attended Bill's funeral, and he spoke about how Bill's story had affected him profoundly, had made him think about family secrets, about the lies we tell children to protect them, and about how truth can be both painful and healing when it finally emerges. He said that the moment when Bill had revealed that his Aunt Rose was actually his mother, the moment when Steve's jaw had literally dropped open because he couldn't process such an unexpected revelation from a 95-year-old man, had been one of the most genuinely shocking moments of his career. He said that Bill had taught him that family stories are often more complex than they appear, that people make impossible sacrifices out of love, and that learning difficult truths late in life can be a gift rather than a tragedy if approached with grace and understanding. The story of Bill Thompson and his mother Rose became a touchstone for discussions about family secrets, adoption, illegitimacy, stigma, and the complex ethics of deception motivated by love. It was referenced in adoption counseling, used in genealogy courses about researching family mysteries, cited in discussions about changing social attitudes toward single parenthood, and shared by countless families who had their own stories of hidden parentage or informal adoptions. The phrase, "Aunt Rose was actually his mother," became shorthand for the revelation of family secrets that recontextualize entire lives while simultaneously affirming that love and family transcend biology and official designations. But perhaps most significantly, Bill's story became a reminder that our identities are often more complex than we realize, that the people we think we know may have sacrificed more than we can imagine, and that truth, even when it comes late and after those involved are dead, has value in allowing us to fully understand and honor the love and sacrifice that shaped our lives. As Bill said in one of his final interviews, "For 85 years, I thought Helen and James were my parents and Rose was my aunt. Learning the truth didn't erase those 85 years or change the fact that Helen and James loved and raised me. It added layers of understanding and gratitude. I now know that I was loved by three people who each sacrificed differently for my well-being. Rose sacrificed being acknowledged as my mother. Helen sacrificed the simplicity of childlessness to raise her sister's child, and James sacrificed the truth to protect me. I spent 85 years with one version of my family story and 10 years with a fuller version, and both versions are true in different ways. I'm grateful for all of it, for the life I was given, for the love I received, for the sacrifices made for me, and for finally understanding the full story before I died. Rose, wherever you are, I know now. I know you were my mother. I know you loved me. I know what you gave up for me. And I love you, Mama. I wish I could have told you that while you were alive, but I'm telling you now I love you, and I understand, and I'm grateful, and I honor your sacrifice and your secret love that protected me for 95 years.